think they're probably pretty good compasses for anyone thinking about where to find purpose. Is look at a way that you can be part of a community and find meaning and purpose in that community, and second, service to that community. But I think anyone who can find a way to tick those two boxes in whatever they do is going to feel the impact, and I think people around them will feel the impact.
Welcome to Chasing Good, a circle group podcast with the aim to help us better understand the good that's happening in the world today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome back to Chasing Good. Here with me today, I have Jeremy Dicker. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining me, mate.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Absolutely.
Let's chat.
Yeah, what a time. How good. All right, so now let's get started. So, Jeremy, you are the managing editor and part of the founding team of Intrigue Media, and and that's a career change after working for 14 years for the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia, having multiple postings around the world among other jobs, but effectively as a diplomat.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting context to kind of have a conversation of. Obviously, over the last 14 years, there's been a lot going on in the world.
Yeah.
Not just from a global foreign policy perspective, but also conflict, trade, all of the things. Super keen to have a bit of a conversation about, I suppose, all of this, but let's start with yourself. So how does one get into diplomacy?
Yeah, it's in some ways it's a job and a career just like any other. There are, procedures and steps you go through to apply and get the job. I guess in my case, I was hungry for work with purpose. I was hungry for adventure. I was hungry to do something that mattered, that went beyond my bottom line. And probably like a lot of kids in Australia, was hungry to do it overseas. Had this nagging sense that I was missing out, that life was happening beyond our beautiful shores. History was being made beyond our beautiful shores. I guess one step that kind of solidified that thinking for me was walking home from uni one day in Sydney, and there's sometimes people leave a stack of books out the front of their dingy share house just to get rid of them, and there was a stack there, most utter crap, but there was one which caught my eye. It was the memoirs of a famous Australian diplomat called Richard Woolcott. It's called The Hot Seat, and I was like, oh, that sounds all right, and gave it a read, and it was just jam-packed with this guy's adventures and service in Moscow and Ghana and Jakarta and Tokyo, and I just was like, how the hell do you get paid to do this stuff? Like, this is amazing. This guy is like serving his community, fighting for causes he believes in, having adventure, getting paid. I just couldn't believe it. So that was probably a crystallizing moment, and it probably nudged me along the way to learn Spanish, which helps. Learning any kind of language, other than English helps. And then, once you kind of graduate uni, like everyone else, you're kind of hunting around for jobs, and I was like everyone else. In my case, my wife and I we got married, basically picked up our degrees, and pursued what we thought was our dream. We thought, wouldn't it be the dream to work for the UN? As a joke, we thought it would be fun to work for the UN on a tropical island. And then after some Googling, we're like, oh, you actually can do that. Sometimes it's worth Googling your dreams in case, you can do that. And so we went to Fiji, where there's a big sort of sub-regional UN office there, just kind of like interns. And that was our first taste of that world, of being hungry to make a difference and I don't know, leave a footprint, beyond our bank account, I guess. And then, applied for the graduate program at Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is kind of one of the main ways that young people join, and they train us up as diplomats, and you do all kinds of interesting stuff. In my case, usually it's like a couple of years in Canberra doing training, and then a couple of years of waiting, sitting on a desk somewhere, working on different issues, and it's interesting stuff. But I didn't join DFAT to sit around in Canberra. I was just hungry to get out. And in my case, I was really lucky. I joined just as Australia was hungry for a seat on the UN Security Council, which means trying to sew up as many votes all around the world from every country. Every country gets a vote, whether you're China or Palau. And so that meant that we were kind of expanding our diplomatic footprint in parts of the world where we hadn't really been that present previously. And one of those parts of the world was Latin America. So we opened a couple of new embassies, and the embassies we already had, we expanded. And so there was this sudden like, oh crap, we need Spanish speakers. And they're like, does anyone speak Spanish? And like, usually they train us up to learn these languages, but in this case, it was like ASAP. So I was like, oh, I speak Spanish. And so like 11 months after joining, barely knowing how to do my tie-up, I was on a flight to Mexico City to start my first posting at the Australian Embassy in Mexico City. And it kind of went from there. Yeah, it was the start of an amazing adventure. 14 years I did on the inside.
That's incredible. And it's such a... There's a few things you've unpacked there, but it is such a cool thing. You've let's Google our dream, make it happen. It's not so common, definitely. But so what do you think was that driver? You mentioned before you didn't want to just earn money. You wanted to do something, the purpose beyond that.
Yeah.
What was the trigger there, out of curiosity?
Well, I think all of us know things in our head, and sometimes we have to experience it ourselves to know it in our heart. I think, it's like, you're a new dad and you'll see that your kid at some point is going to try and touch the hot plate even after you said don't touch it, because like, oh, I just want to check that out for myself, and and I kind of, in my case, had to do that a few times. There's a truth that we human beings have been like blurting out, trumpeting out to everyone for thousands of years, that money is not the answer. It's important, and it's part of the answer to how we raise a family and meet our needs and serve our community, but it's not the answer. And that's in religious texts from thousands of years ago, like Ecclesiastes. Or you could come and look at famous celebrities who've said the same thing, right? And a couple of those names resonated with me as well. There was Matt Damon, when he was in his 20s when he won his Oscar for screenwriting for Good Will Hunting. And someone was like, oh, how did you feel that night? And he's like, honestly, the overriding emotion I felt was sadness, because I was holding this trophy and it didn't do anything. And I felt a real sadness that this city was full of people burning their entire lives up in the hopes of holding this trophy. And he was learning in his 20s that it wasn't the answer. There was another cracking quote from Jim Carrey, who I love, who was like, I wish everyone could be rich and famous so that they could know it's not the answer. So like, I think I've always had this sense that money and wealth and prosperity, this is important stuff. It ties to livelihoods and people's ability to live noble and purposeful lives, but it was not the thing to chase. But then in terms of like, what do you do then? That was what I always struggled with. When I talk about like touching the hot iron, having to learn for myself, one way I thought about this early on, one of Australia's most successful entrepreneurs is Twiggy Forrest, right? Like a billionaire mining magnate. And when he was in his 20s, and he was dating the woman who he ended up marrying, and he said something to the effect of, oh, I want to make $50 million so I can give it all away. And he's ended up making, outrageously more than $50 million. But I loved that spirit of like pursuing money and wealth with an extrinsic purpose of doing good with it. And so I did flirt with a sort of corporate career. But for some people, the thrill of the corporate career itself is enough. For other people, the extrinsic value of it, like earning the money to do good with the money you earn, is enough. I guess in my case, I learned that even with the promise of maybe having some serious cash 20 years down the line or whatever, I still had to get up every morning and go to work and sit at a desk. And in one particular instance, I was working on some dispute between two garbage collection companies, and these are important services that every city needs, but I was sitting there being like, I don't care which one of these companies wins. So I guess all of us have sort of different criteria and attributes that we bring to this world, and it nudges us in different directions. And I think I learned pretty early on that even with the hope of being able to spend money on something purposeful and meaningful, even that wasn't going to be enough for me. So I needed to be doing something that day in, day out got me out of bed excited. And so I think that's what ultimately nudged me to something that in and of itself was built around service and adventure.
And 14 years is it's a decent stint, right? Particularly in public service. Well, not particularly necessarily, but because it is common
definitely
to
in public service.
But it is a long time to live that kind of a global lifestyle, I suppose, when you're traveling around and you're not necessarily centered in one location. And then so you've subsequently come to Intrigue Media, or helped start Intrigue Media, and you're growing up. So you've gone from that to start up. Do you want to quickly explain what you're doing there with Intrigue?
Yeah. I did 3 postings: Mexico, Peru, and USA, and then along the way, I mean, I'm going to miss so much about that life on the inside. Like, it's just a very unusual, unique, wild life with all these just endless stories that you can share, and that my girls love learning about now. They're like, "What? You did that, and you went there." And so I'm going to miss a lot of that stuff. One of the things I'll miss is the people it attracts, because it attracts people with similar hunger to get out there and to have adventure and try and do work with purpose and scratch that itch for adventure. And some remarkable, brilliant people as well. Like, I remember thinking, I felt pretty smug walking in the door with like rusty university Spanish. And there was a guy the year ahead of me who spoke 7 languages fluently, and friends of mine just casually like fluent in Japanese, Mandarin, Korean. So I found that so uplifting and edifying to be surrounded by brilliant people, hardworking people really committed to doing work with purpose. 2 of the people that I met along the way, I guess, had similar, nagging feelings that maybe their next move was going to be on the outside. DFAT's full of lifers who you got to like wheel out after 50 years or whatever. But there are some people who are like, I'm not sure this is going to be me long term. So two friends of mine who I met along the way, just brilliant people. One, John Fowler, who went to do his MBA in the UK, and another, Helen Jung, who went to Harvard as a Fulbright scholar. And they had done postings in China and Israel and elsewhere. But yeah, just brilliant, thoughtful, hungry people. And they had this idea during COVID lockdowns. They were like stuck at home or in their university dorm or whatever, overwhelmed with information, a lot of it quite dire, and just every day, the events overwhelming what we were still processing only the day before. And I think, John had this sense of, well, hang on, if I'm like a professional diplomat who speaks Mandarin, and I've been paid to think about the world and think about the way it works, and I'm overwhelmed and confused by all this, then it must be the same for many, many other people out there. And so they had this idea to start Intrigue Media. Our flagship product is called International Intrigue, and it's a daily briefing written by ex-diplomats. And the idea, I guess, is to solve that problem that John was identifying and Helen was identifying, but several problems tied to it, which we can get to later if you want. But yeah, that's what we do. We've got 115,000 subscribers, growing very fast. Mostly our readership is in the US, DC and Wall Street and places like that. And it's really building a community of people who shared a lot of the things that that drove us into diplomacy in the first place, and then into helping build Intrigue Media, which is a hunger to understand the world, a feeling like we are living through wild historic times, a feeling like the decisions that our political leaders make are going to have very, very long tails in ways that maybe they didn't a couple of decades ago when everything was hunky-dory and smooth and safe. And a feeling like just wanting to be more connected to this wild, amazing world of ours, but through a community that they trust. And part of that, I guess, is because they lost trust in the sources that that used to connect them with the world, and we can agree or not agree whether that trust deserved to be lost or not. And I have mixed views on that. But yeah, those are some of the drivers that I think motivated John and Helen, and then me and others to come and build Intrigue. And some of the drivers why I think we're growing so fast. A lot of people have that same yearning to stay on top of our world.
It's typically the first thing that I try and do when I wake up in bed. I'll read the daily email because it is I've never been able to. It's digestible. It's so easily digestible. Taking all of these complex things and just highlighting the big things that happen over the last 24 hours, and it's such a.
Yeah.
It is a really fantastic thing. I would like to kind of dive back into your career as a diplomat. Can we start by? Can you explain what is a diplomat exactly? What's a day to day?
Well, that's one of the awesome things about it is that there's no one day to day, and that's one of the things again that I'll miss about it. The job I did in Mexico City was like unrecognizable to the one I did in Peru, and that was unrecognizable to the one I did in the US. And that's what keeps it so interesting. That's why so many of us were lifers. It's just like, well, I could leave, but who knows what's around the corner? I could be in Tokyo next year and could be working on, I don't know, whaling or just something wild, But I guess one way to think about the day-to-day, we're representing the Australian government overseas. And I think that basically means a couple of things. One is we're the Australian government's eyes and ears. So we're there on the ground, kind of like you could say we're like an investigative reporter. We're like, this thing that's happening here seems like it's going to impact Australia for good or for ill. And I'm pretty sure people in Canberra will want to know about that. So I'm going to go in, ask questions, and go to a few events. And then you go back to the embassy and you type up a cable, which is a fancy word for an email, basically, but there's just a very specific style and structure, and it goes on an encrypted system or whatever. But it's basically just, it's basically just that. And you send it back. And so that's one way in which we are the eyes and ears. We're also the mouth. When those things are happening, there might be a vote coming up at the UN General Assembly, or there might be the UN climate talks that are happening right now in Baku, Azerbaijan. I think I just said that wrong, but it's Friday and we've got little kids at home, but people understand what country I'm talking about. And so there could be these things breaking, or maybe maybe a government where we send lots of beef is thinking about slapping huge tariffs on the beef that we sell. All these random things can be happening, any sector, any country, any level of urgency, but they're just constantly happening, and they're constantly bumping up against what's good for Australia. And so when I say we're the mouthpiece, you go in, you might go to the Foreign Ministry of Mexico, or you might go to the Trade Ministry of Peru, or you might go to a security ministry in one of these countries, and you knock on the door and be like, hey, this thing you guys are working on, can we talk about this? Because what you're going to do is great for us, or it's bad for us, and can we find a different way to do this? So those are I guess the two ways I think about it: relaying messages out and bringing information in.
So many layers, and the concept of national interest as well.
Yeah.
Which, in the beauty of democracy, can shift and change.
Yeah.
On the day. So I suppose information is hugely important for you in these kind of positions, being able to understand what's going on. So how would you be given a framework of this is what we're supposed to be looking for, this is the direction we're looking to take, this is what's important to us this year, this decade? Was there a general direction that you would look to pursue?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess a couple of things there. One, in terms of like, how do you think about the national interest? And then the other, how do you take that forward and be across that? I guess answering the second part first. One of the things I love about Australia is that by and large, our politics is ridiculous and people argue about stuff, and I don't know, right now everyone's arguing about Qantas upgrades or something, right? Like, these are important discussions to have, and that vigorous debate is what I think makes any democracy healthy. But on like big directional questions about where Australia is in our region in the world, there's differences in emphasis and style and prioritization, but fundamentally, I think the two main parties in this country really see eye to eye. And that was one of the things I loved about working as an Australian diplomat. It wasn't too dramatic either way, whichever party came into power. There were not going to be like radical left turns or right turns or whatever. It was really a question of degree. That's changing in some ways, and I don't think that's a reflection on Australia or the quality of our political debate. It is a bit, but I think it's more the reality of the world that our country is hurtling into. The stakes are higher, the margin for error is more narrow, and that I think is changing the way our political leaders think about this stuff. Then I guess the first part of the question, like thinking about the national interest, it's kind of like a funny term, and I took a little bit of time out while my wife was finishing her PhD, and so I had some like 9 months out of DFAT on leave without pay, and I ended up going to film school, and so I was this like clean-cut government guy, just kind of parachuting into this a brilliant film school, the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, like one of the best ones in the country, one of the best ones in the world, and I felt lucky to be there. But these were these like creative types with like asymmetrical haircuts and thick rimmed glasses and deep thoughts about the world, and there was a lot of like eye rolling, I guess, at me, who was very much like Captain Clean Cut government kind of guy, conservative, not in like the political way, but like I guess in the way I thought about the world and our place in it. And I remember one time someone they're just interested and curious people, and I was sitting there having a beer with them, and they were like, they asked me, what is the national interest? Like, it's such a bullshit term, and it's just used by like, conservative politicians trying to start a war or whatever. And I guess the way I answered it with those people, friends of mine, is maybe a way I'll answer it now, which is that, all the people at that table happen to be either new Australians, like migrants, or the children of new Australians or migrant. And if you went through all the stories that brought them to this country, every single one of those stories pointed to our national interest. Some came because they were fleeing violence and war from another part of the world. And so the national interest that they were pointing to on their journey to this country was stability and security. Others came from parts of the world with just devastating economic malaise and just no opportunity to pull yourself or your family out of an endless, hopeless cycle. And so the national interest they were pointing to when they came to this country was prosperity and opportunity. Tied to both of those things, others came from places where you could not get ahead or could not raise your voice without fear of being chucked in jail because you said the wrong thing or you came from the wrong corner of society. The national interest they were pointing to when they or their parents came to this country was democracy and equality. You and I could say something right now outrageous about Anthony Albanese and nothing's going to happen. And that's not because Anthony Albanese is weak or whoever replaces him is weak. It's because this country is strong and our political system is strong. And no leader cares about what any random guy in a Hawaiian shirt on the Sunshine Coast says. Like, we're stronger than that. But you could list some quote unquote strong countries out there where that's not the case. So all those things that each of those friends of mine sitting around having a beer, the way that they, and I, if you go back far enough, the way that all of us came to this country was pointing in one way or another to a national interest. And so when we're out there working in an embassy or a consulate, those are the kind of true norths that help us shape what we get involved in and what we do once we're involved in it. Our security, our prosperity, our democracy, our stability.
Would you say that those true norths, that's effectively the pillars of an effective country economy?
Yeah.
In many ways.
For us, anyway. I mean, I think every society, every country is at a different stage of their own journey, and I don't think it's a cookie cutter answer to every community in every part of the world. But I do see it as a true north. I mean, at some point, I do feel there is an inevitability that everyone and every human being is, endowed with the same basic yearnings, which include freedom, security, prosperity, and ultimately governments that think that they can trade off one for the other. Like, we'll give you prosperity, but you're not going to be able to say anything that we don't like. I mean, ultimately, those sorts of models of government are not sustainable in the long term. But yeah, I think it's too complicated to say that you could just go in at any one point in time in any country and lurch to a different model and get good results. I think it's a lot, human history and human beings, we're much more complicated than that.
Is there anything missing from that list, do you think?
Like the sort of national interest list?
Yeah, I mean, what you've just described, by all accounts, you sold me, right? It's a beautiful way to describe the concept of national interest, right? You've simplified it into categories which also come down to basic human needs and wants, and so I suppose the question, what I'm wondering in the back of my head while you're talking is, I suppose two questions here. First is, do you see that changing in different cultures around the world with different, because these seem to me to be quite basic human needs.
Yeah.
And so do you see, in your experience, has that been different in different cultures around the world, or has that always been the core want? And secondly, if those are the core, if stripped back, if those are the core wants, needs, is there anything else?
Yeah. I wouldn't pretend that that it's a complete and exhaustive list. You could add things like it starts to get a little more removed from concepts that all of us, including film students in inner Sydney, drinking a beer would instantly resonate with and connect with. But you could add in not through a lack of intelligence, but just like it zooms out a little bit from our day-to-day lives. But you could add things like the rule of law, which is something, it's like the air we breathe in a country like Australia. We just kind of I don't think understand it or appreciate it until we've spent a lot of time in a country where it doesn't exist, and you just all of a sudden your whole framework for living your life flips, because you just feel at any point you could get screwed and there is no one out there that would be in your corner. So rule of law, human rights, people would say is that others, they would say that that's the kind of foundation for all of the above. There are other things you can add, but I guess at that table with those film students drinking those beers, that that felt like the best answer to give. In terms of how I've seen it differ around the world, absolutely. Human beings are so complicated, so nuanced, and I've absolutely seen it. So we are head creatures, but we're also heart creatures, and there are other forces that appeal to our heart, and I think political leadership has to adapt to those realities. So one example is like nationalism or faith or ideology. I don't see these as inherently good or bad forces, but they're realities that are in some ways the most powerful motivators for human action anywhere in the world. We'll feel intense feelings of commitment and euphoria and passion from our faith or ideology, or a sense of pride to the nation, pride for the nation that we belong to. sometimes that can get warped and can drive people and societies to do wrong, evil things. So yeah, the way that those forces interplay with the sort of more clean-cut national interests that I described is very complex and looks very different in different parts of the world. And the different philosophical traditions that different societies bring to that is very important as well. I mean, so for example, some powers like China pay lip service to the concept of universal human rights and the inherent dignity of every individual. They'll pay lip service to that, but they tend to put more emphasis on the broader rights of the community, and not necessarily in bad ways, but when it's taken to its extreme and loses sight of the inherent right and dignity of an individual, then yes, I do think it goes too far, and in some ways is used as justification for, in this case, the Communist Party of China to bolster and cling to its own power. We're the ones that can keep you safe and prosperous, and for that to happen, you need to continue to surrender your basic dignity and freedom to be able to say what you like, because that's better for the whole community. So yeah, it plays out differently, it looks differently, and in a lot of ways, the work of a diplomat is navigating that. It is realizing that Australia has interest A that we're worried about, and having a conversation with your counterparts in the other country and figuring out, before you go in for that conversation, figuring out why it is that they are thinking about doing this, what are the drivers, what are the pressures that they're under, and thinking if there's a way you can come at it which makes them feeling like, oh, that's actually a good idea. And it turns out it's what Australia wants as well. And a lot of the time there is. A lot of the time these issues aren't binary. A lot of the time there's not, adversarial or malicious intent. A lot of the time it's just different communities bumping up against each other in pursuit of their own definition of happiness. And with a little bit of tact and research and strategy, you can find a way through. But sometimes it is adversarial and malicious and binary. Yeah.
These skills that you've learnt through this process, I imagine, would have made a incredible impact on your personal life.
Yeah.
The way what you're able to take. How has it impacted the way that you look at the world on a personal level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the career itself absolutely impacts the personal life in ways that I don't think you were referring to, but maybe I'll just mention, yes, it's amazing to have these adventures, and it's an honor to serve your community, your country in any way, let alone with a diplomatic passport and out in an embassy somewhere and flying the flag. I mean, that, of course, that's an honor. But yeah, the impact on people's personal lives is real. DFAT has a really high divorce rate, which is not, I don't mean that as a diss to any of the friends of mine that have gone through that and are going through that. I more mean that as an example of the fact that it puts a lot of pressure on relationships, constantly disrupting, moving, long hours, spouses' careers getting just tossed overboard as you move from place to place. So that's one way that it really disrupts personal lives, and it's a negative. I guess another, while we're touching on negative, another way that I would dare say that it's shaped my thinking is I wish this weren't the case, but I think my 14 years left me more cynical. I just saw a lot of the world, including some dark places, and I saw, in some cases, humanity at its most depraved, and most wayward and most lost. And you can't unsee that stuff. You can process it and reflect on it and move through it, but you can't unsee it. And I, part of me yearns for that naive, idealistic, optimistic Jeremy that was around, out of uni. But I think he's gone. I think not gone, but very different. And I think partly that's what motivated my wife and I to think about moving to a place like where we are in Australia's Sunshine Coast, as a little bubble where we could recreate that optimism and idealism for our kids, and in the same way that our parents did for us. And that probably gave us the strength and resilience to go out and do these careers, which involve staring into the abyss, which, as Nietzsche said, also stares it back into you. So those are a couple of negative ways that I think it does shape the way that we think about the world. It's overwhelmingly positive, but the answers coming into my mind are negative, and I'll give one more. One of the awesome things about what we do at Intrigue, we have this incredible audience of people who are out in the world doing these kinds of fascinating jobs. And one time, we have these personal introductions from John or Helen and I, sharing some anecdotes or reflections about our lives on the inside. And one time I was sharing about how in many countries, including Australia, if you work as a spy, as an intelligence officer, for example, if you work for what's called the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, ASIS, which is kind of like our CIA, you're not allowed to quit and be like, hey everyone, I used to work for ASIS. It's more complicated than that, and a lot of governments like that. It's what you did is forever a secret. Others, including France, they have a cooling off period where you work for the DGSE, which is their equivalent of CIA or ASIS, and then after 7 years after you quit, then you can say, hey everyone, I used to be a French spy, look at me. And so I mentioned that because a few years ago, out of the blue, this French dude living on the northern beaches of Sydney did that. He was like, hey everyone, I used to be a French spy, and he's married to an Australian woman. And the reason why he was sort of coming out of the shadows, it's not his style. Like, people who go into that work don't want the attention, but he was publishing his first book, which I had read because I met him a couple of years earlier and thought, oh, that's pretty cool. Read his book. It's a brilliant book, so dark and gritty and anchored in all these raw, brutal experiences that he had in service of his country. And anyway, so I mentioned in my intro, like, that I read this book and it's great and check it out. And I'm not like some influencer in my activewear hawking products down at Bondi Beach or whatever. I just did it because that's what we do. We're an authentic platform, and people like to hear what we're thinking about. Anyway, and his fake name that he uses is Jack Beaumont. And I didn't realize was among our audience. He wrote back and he's like, oh, thank you so much for that kind shout out. Anyway, so we ended up meeting and doing an interview with him, and we shared that with our audience. And it was a fascinating chat. But one of the things that Jack said, because I asked him a similar question that you just asked me, and the way that it's shaped him, I think it's shaped him. Anyone who's been in the military or intelligence services, I think, has stared more intently into a darker, deeper abyss than what most diplomats do. And I think in his case, and others that he's worked with, they're wrestling with PTSD, and he's quite open about that, which is why he wrote the book, to try and help more of his former colleagues process that and move through that. But when I asked him that question, he said it's a little bit like scuba diving. Before he went scuba diving, he would just look out at the beautiful ocean, see the sunset, the birds, and that was it. Go on with his life. But once he did that, and saw what was underneath, and yes, there's beauty and depth, but he also saw terrifying things down there, deadly things down there. And once you see that, you can't unsee that. And so he described it, he's left the French intelligence services like a decade ago now, and he looks out at the world and he sees the same stuff all of us see in the news, but he's also aware of what lies beneath, and he can't unsee that. In his case, there's in my case as well, like any Western government official with access to sensitive information is trained to have a healthy degree of paranoia about why that guy is outside repairing your wires, or why this guy fixing your fridge has a Russian accent, or just like you just constant. What is that van out there? Like there's a constant paranoia, and I think that is a symptom of the same way that work kind of shapes the way you think about the world. It's hard to trust people. It's hard not to second guess. My wife and I were just talking about this. Like something happened. I don't need to get into details, but I saw it in a very cynical way. I was like, I think they might be trying to screw us. And Nicole's like, I don't think so. And she just called the person up. And of course they weren't trying to screw us. You know what I mean? And so that's one way, one kitchen table example of how the work is kind of shaped. And that was all very negative, which I didn't mean, but those are the answers that came to mind. There are positive ways as well that the work kind of shapes the way we think about the world.
I wouldn't say that's negative. Is having a concept of reality negative?
It's a lot of context and texture and nuance and
like just
sure.
Because you can see the thorns with the roses doesn't mean that the whole picture isn't still beautiful.
Yeah, amen. Well said.
There's so many pieces to this. I suppose I definitely want to dive into a few things because you've been the last, let's say, 15 years has been a tremendous transformative period across the world.
Yeah.
For individuals, for nations, for the world, advancements for technologies, developments of economies, political, social movements. Can you tell me about what you've seen from a change in the world perspective?
Yeah. I mean, the changes are startling and hurtling us towards a world that I think may well be unrecognizable. And for that to have happened when I and my buddies joined the Foreign Service and went out to do these postings, I mean, in a sort of selfishly fascinated way, I felt lucky to be like getting a front row seat to this stuff. But it is, it's hard to even know where to start because every dimension of human life, every dimension of our world is going through wild, exciting, exhilarating, but also terrifying change. I guess one of the ways that we think about that is, I was born in the 80s, right? And that was the world that my parents really grew up in, and maybe your parents too, and other people listening's parents. And that was what you might describe as a bipolar world. You could take a map, and there were really two cities that you'd point to where the people in those two cities could really shape developments anywhere in the world. And those two cities were Moscow and Washington. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and that took us into an unrecognizable unipolar world where there was just this one superpower, way more powerful than anyone else even close. So that's been the unipolar world that I really grew up in. Like once I was kind of old enough to understand and think about the world and go to school, like through the 90s and beyond. Unipolar. And probably a lot of us grew up taking that for granted and assuming it to be the natural way of the world and the default status of the world. And no one really knew where we were heading, but there were brilliant, smart people who for example, Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, and he's nuanced that, and people have taken his work out of context. But like there was a sense of like we've reached it, like this is the pinnacle, and the rest of the world will become like this one pole, the US, but just more broadly, like a prosperous, secure, stable world. But it hasn't really played out that way. That unipolar world is now giving way to a multipolar world. More and more cities are wanting to, capital cities, wanting to and seeing an opportunity to, as their own relative power grows and their wealth, their prosperity, their heft on the global stage grows, they're, elbowing their way to create more space for themselves, to shape their own region in their own image a bit more. And that's the process we're in now, a multipolar world. The US is still the only truly global power, and it has advantages that are remarkable, including a capacity for regeneration and course correction, which I think is hard to get outside the democratic world. But others, Beijing, or Brasilia, or Ankara, Abuja, like all these powers feeling a sense of they want to, chart their own course a little more. And that's the world we're in. I think in some ways, you can't begrudge any country that wants to shape its own destiny a little more. I think the issue is, though, that some of those countries wanting to shape their destiny, they're doing it in a way that seeks to upend or significantly reform the whole international system that we've taken for granted. The UN, the law of the sea, treaties, the trading system through the World Trade Organization. As countries bump up against those different rules that were really kind of US led and inspired after World War II, as all these countries bump up against those rules, and previously they're like, well, they're the rules and the US is the one kind of enforcing them, so there's nothing we can do about it. That calculation has changed. The US is still powerful, but it's maybe getting a little more introspective at the moment, and Donald Trump's re-election reflects that. So there's a little bit of that US introspection, but also just more power, and the power equation is a little different, and countries feel a little more confident pushing back. And so the net result is that there's a lot of pressure on all those rules and bodies and systems that I grew up with taking for granted, and which most countries, like Australia, desperately need, because most of us aren't big enough to push our neighbours around and get what we want through just sheer willpower and force. We rely on some agreed upon rules to negotiate our way through. So while individually these countries pursuing their interests, you can maybe understand, we use the term strategic empathy. You can get where they're coming from. You don't necessarily like it, but you can get where they're coming from. And by the way, the US is doing this as well. But the net result for most countries, I think, is going to be a scarier, more volatile, unpredictable world with way less trust. Because those international systems and rules were the ways that we mediated trust and worked with each other with guardrails of like, all right, we can do this or that, but we all vaguely are going to play in these, in these guardrails. So that's maybe a long-winded, highfalutin answer, but that's kind of how I see it. And you could drill down into kind of any problem that we're seeing in the world right now, and there's a good chance you could, or not even problem, but a big change, and you could tie it back to the fact that we're going from a unipolar to a multipolar world.
And it's fascinating as well because the way that what I hear from that is that effectively having one country with the big stick and a moral compass that is widely accepted is the effective, or has proven to be a very effective way to exist as a civilization, which kind of goes, which in part, brings about the debate around, capitalism, around the old monarchies, around communism, around the systems that we've built.
Yeah. I mean, you've just described the Pax Americana, the American peace. And I mean, there are some parts of the world that got screwed by that. I mean, I don't want to pretend that it was all beer and Skittles, with some disastrous decisions like the invasion of Iraq. The second one, the first one, was, most people say, was the right thing, because it, undid Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. But anyway, there have been disastrous decisions. I don't want to pretend like it was all beer and Skittles for everyone. I think one thing we may learn the hard way in the West. So, for example, people rightly criticize disastrous decisions like the invasion of Iraq, but then go too far and yearn for a post-US led world. Well, yeah, we can debate whether that's too far or not, but they go beyond criticizing the specific decisions within the system and criticize the system. And I think the result is that at some point in our lives, we will realize that what comes after the US-led system is potentially going to look very different, and we'll realize that the things that we take for granted, like human rights and treaties and the law of the sea and like all these things that just quietly regulate the way the world has worked, that those things are not necessarily the natural state of our world. If World War II had ended differently and some other power had been the one in the position to remake the world order, I don't think any of them necessarily would have decided, let's build the United Nations, let's build the IMF, later let's build the WTO. I mean, all these things that fundamentally limited America's own power by putting rules around itself, putting others at the table with it on the UN Security Council. That's historically very unusual for a dominant power to emerge on top of the world and then build a system that limits its own power, but does so because it thinks it's ultimately in its own best interest to be in a world that's regulated with rules and forums to discuss. So I think we may well learn that what comes next makes us yearn for that. I guess the grim reality though is that what made that work, as you said, was having one flawed, but I think still fundamentally with a true north that many of us would believe in. That system worked because there was that one big power holding the big stick. Yeah.
Obviously, it is. I kind of go back to your time on the inside again. That purpose as an individual, it's so hard to find individual purpose. What we've just described is, overwhelming to everyone. The individual, it feels, holds less power now than they ever have, seemingly. Arguably not with the evolution of technology and how connected we are and how our voice can be reached, but it feels that way. How would you say that an individual can find purpose in this modern world that's so complex and so rapidly evolving and not necessarily evolving in a comfortable way?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it is evolving in an awesome way. I don't know where things will land. I do think I'm optimistic about where our world is headed. Everywhere I see a problem, I also see a solution. Like, climate change, I think we're starting to feel like it's no longer this distant talking point. It's a thing that people are feeling in their lives, whereas devastating floods in Spain or like no snow on Mount Fuji still like way later than what historically should and has been the case. These are the problems that we're seeing, but the same day that the same day that the news came out that, for example, we're going to breach the 1.5 degree limit that the whole world established in the Paris Agreement in 2015. We're breaching that this year for the first time, which is like, oh crap. But then also a startup across the ditch in New Zealand just figured out a new way to make plasma as a pretty meaningful step towards nuclear fusion. So it's like, we could be a few years away from this kind of holy grail sci-fi carbon-free technology. And that's just one example. I think.
Those damn Kiwis.
Yeah. So I see solutions everywhere. The particular sandpit that I play in terms of geopolitics, it's the problems aren't so specific and the solutions aren't so precise, but I fundamentally feel that there is a better world ahead waiting for us. But in terms of how do we find purpose in the meantime, day to day as individuals. I think you hit the nail on the head. People do feel more powerless. I think one of the ways that I feel good and we feel a sense of purpose in what we're doing at Intrigue is building this community of influential decision makers in DC and New York and Silicon Valley and Sydney and elsewhere, and meeting them where they are use the word digestible, in a digestible way, to empower them with a clear understanding of what's happening in the world, and that they can take that into how they think about their work, the decisions they make, who they vote for, whatever. So I feel a sense of purpose and good in that. And I think anyone can find something like that. I think the way that plays out, I mean, when I was on the inside as part of a huge organization, that can be quite hard, because you are like literally replaceable, and a tiny cog in a big machine. But fundamentally, there were a couple of ways I thought about it. One was just fundamentally seeking to do the next right thing, which is a cheesy thing. I think I even heard it in Frozen, the Disney animation. I think there might be a song about that. But it's like an ancient principle as well. There was a best-selling book out of Japan called The Courage to Be Disliked, which is worth a read for the journey. But the conclusion, the destination of this book is fundamentally that. Yes, it's overwhelming and we're tiny. What we can do is focus on doing the next right thing. And in terms of what that is and defining that purpose and that direction, for me, it goes back, I guess, to where we started, which was different human beings have expressed this in different ways. Another way folks might be interested to check out is the longest ever study into the causes of human happiness out of Harvard. It's like 85 years they've been doing this study. One was community, and the other was service, like probably the two main things that drive human happiness. And so I think they're probably pretty good compasses for anyone thinking about where to find purpose. Is look at a way that you can be part of a community and find meaning and purpose in that community, and second, service to that community. I think though, if you can find a way to tick those two things, and I just think there are infinite ways to tick those two things in every sector and every job. And sometimes it's just a switch in mindset rather than a switch in job. But I think anyone who can find a way to tick those two boxes in whatever they do is going to feel the impact. And I think people around them will feel the impact. And I think we all do that. I think our country, our community, our world, I think is going to be on a better trajectory.
So would you say then that is what good is to you?
Yeah. A guy in a Hawaiian shirt, I don't think can say it any better than what it's been said for a couple of thousand years now, which is, it's the golden rule. Do unto others. We all fail at it, but that's, I think, a pretty good true north when it comes to defining good. Chasing good, as some might say.
As some might say, indeed, sir. Yes. And when you apply these same do unto others, because from a individual level, if every individual had the opportunity to do that, I genuinely believe that as individuals, you can, you lift the center of the cloth and the corners will rise too, right? Like, it does impact around and it can make quite a significant difference. But there is a point where policy and national interest and starts to pull away from those fundamentals of do unto others.
Yeah.
Where does that happen?
Yeah. I think it. I see what you're getting at.
Where does individual interest start to not matter as much?
Yeah.
Or individual good? I should say.
Yeah. I mean, it's those sorts of discussions, I was a part of them in Canberra a lot, trying to anchor some big decision that had to be made at the, government leader level, and reflecting on what that meant for the day-to-day interests of the people that we're paid and in some cases elected to represent. But also, sometimes there's a zero-sum mentality at the international stage. Like, either we get this trade deal in our favor or their favor, and let's make it our favor. I think I rarely saw tension like that at the heart of Australia's approach to the world. And that's one of the other reasons I felt lucky to work for Australia as a diplomat. There were, counterparts working for other governments where they had a very different philosophy for the way to deal with these questions, and it was a much more zero-sum philosophy. So Mexico, for example, I don't mean this about Mexico, but one of their Nobel laureate, great contributors to our world was a guy called Octavio Paz, who won. He's a brilliant writer, and he had this saying: "Para el mexicano toda la vida es una oportunidad para chingar o ser chingada," which is extremely profane in Spanish. I'll give you the PG translation, which is like for a person in Mexico, life is an opportunity to screw over or be screwed over. And that was him describing Mexico in the 70s. And that was just his opinion. I'm not talking about Mexico, but that's an example of how other governments see international relations as a chance to either screw over or be screwed over. I think fundamentally it's a long-term proposition to model good international citizenship and behave in a way that builds trust. And I think in time, I'm optimistic that it can and it does blunt some of those edges. And that in turn undermines some of the hawkish attitudes from individual political leaders or officials on the other side. And in time, the fundamental equation can evolve into a more positive way.
Before, when you said that you're optimistic about the future of the world,
Yeah.
what does that look like?
Yeah, I am optimistic because despite the grim headlines, and in some ways the grim headlines attract eyeballs, which drive clicks, which drive revenue, I guess. I don't want to be too cynical about the news, but there's a degree of that. But yeah, there are some grim things happening in the world. Despite that, like I mentioned earlier, wherever I see problems, I do see solutions. I see, for example, in Europe, Russia invading its neighbor. I do see a solution there, and it's going to be at the end of a horrible war that Putin decided to start. But I do see a solution. I do see a world where him and his neo-imperialistic, genocidal, racist vision is defeated, and a new Russia can emerge out of that with better leadership that doesn't feel like its own political legitimacy is anchored in the invasion and domination of its neighbors. So I can see those sorts of solutions everywhere, and fundamentally, I do think that they will come. The question is how quickly and at what cost.
The principles that undermine, human nature, I also believe are quite good. But it's interesting, when you talk about this, as you say, we've grown up in this world of principles, of laws, of ethics that have been governed. So to grow up in a world that is not like that, to not have those baseline principles, would be very interesting to see how that human nature therefore impacts
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have friends from the Foreign Service who were born in or partly grew up in former Soviet states. And I love hearing how they think about that, because they were born into a very cynical, and I would say dark worldview. Soviet was an authoritarian, anti-human rights, anti-democratic, anti-individual. You could throw in 50 more antis. Just a very ultimately destructive philosophy and worldview, and they were born into that. And they described what that looked like for them and their families. One example was the fact that if you're in some of these cities, for example, Moscow, you might hear an ambulance coming with its sirens blaring, but no one will move aside because the assumption is that it's just some rich guy who's just bribed an ambulance driver to get through the traffic. That's an example of the sort of cynicism that just pervades, where just trust is completely broken down, and that's hard to shake off. My friends have shaken it off, and them and their families have built new lives in Australia, which has its own cynicism and its own blind spots, of course, but fundamentally on a better trajectory. You can change and evolve and see the light at some point.
Amazing. I am just blown away. Jeremy, mate, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
This is all we have time for today. But again, thank you for all that you've done. Thank you for the commitment that you made to the world, the way that you continue to help today. I genuinely wish you all the best, and I thank you again for your time, mate.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks so much for listening to Chasing Good, a Circle Group podcast. Our mission is to shift the world closer to kindness, sustainability, awareness, and action. We hope you enjoyed. Until next time.